In the early part of Treta Yuga, or second cycle of the universe, there lived in the wild forest a pious sage named Valmiki. One fine morning, on his usual resort to the riverside to perform his daily ablution in the waters of Tamas in company with his faithful disciple Bhardwaj, this devout sage was struck aghast at the sight beside his path of a mortally wounded crouch bird, the victim of a cruel hunter's bow and arrow, and the hunter himself in posture, jubilant over his fallen prey. It sent through the sage's soft heart a thrill of pity and horror. He scarcely could subdue his agitated feelings, and in the impulse of the moment pronounced upon the merciless hunter a curse. That curse fell from his lips in the form of a shlok in metrical perfection. In silent self astonishment stood the sage for a while, then turning round to his disciple, confessed that the shlok was an extempore composition divinely inspired. Lord Brahma came on a visit to Valmiki and declared unto the venerable sage that by divine inspiration he would acquire a complete knowledge of the life history of Ram, which, however, he was enjoined to record in writing, omitting not even the smallest incident therein. Thus, divinely inspired Valmiki wrote the Ramayan. He recited its countless verses to Love and Kush, the sons of Ram, who committed the whole story to memory with miraculous precision, and sang the lay from first to last to the strains of music before Ram and his court, much to their delight and astonishment. The boundless joy and of Ram in particular over the masterly and melodiously delivery of the shlok by his youthful sons, enrapturing him in a reverie. The story. In days of yore there lived and ruled in Ayodhya a king named Dashrath, who, although he had attained an age said to have covered more than 600 centuries, unhappily had no issue by any of his three royal consorts. In his solicitude for acquisition of sons to perpetuate his lineage and to inherit his vast dominions, the king held a consultation with Vashisht Mahamuni, his guru, who counseled his royal disciple to offer up horse sacrifice, referred as Ashwamedha, in order that thus propitiated the gods may condescend to gratify his desire for male offspring, referred as Putra Kameshti. The royal disciple gladly acquiesced in the Guru's proposal. All necessary preliminaries were forthwith arranged, and with befitting solemnity, the sacrifice was most devoutly offered. On its completion, there evolved from out of the sacrificial frames Prajapatya with a vase of gold in hand, containing nectar and ambrosia, which he offered to the king. Piously, the king received the sacred vessel, and of precious contents thereof he gave one half to his senior consort Kaushalya, 1/4 to his second consort Kaikai, and the remainder to his third consort Sumitra. Piously also did the queens partake of the food and drink of the gods. In due course they conceived, And at auspicious hours they bore sons unto the king. Kaushalya brought forth a son named Ram, the hero of these pages, Kaikai a son named Bharat, and Sumitra two sons named respectively Lakshman and Shatrughan. Lakshman always showed an inalienable attachment towards Ram, and like attachment sprang up in Shatrughan towards Bharat. The princes had scarcely attained their 12th year when one day the royal sage Vishwamitra approached Dashrath, protesting that his daily oblation to the gods was being wantonly disturbed by certain Rakshas, and entreating that to perform his sacrifice unmolested, he may be allowed the company of Ram at his cottage to keep the miscreants under restraint. The king was loth to comply with this request, for Ram was both tender in years and a novice to the stratagems of the Rakshas and their methods of warfare. Indignantly, the royal sage half retraced his steps, remarking that both Dashrath and his guru knew fully well the latent capabilities of Ram, and hinting that the king's apparent reluctance was unworthy of royal personages. Dashrath was touched to the quick by this sarcastic rebuke. He instantly, yet reluctantly, let Ram follow Vishwamitra, and needless to say, his inseparable brother Lakshman followed him. On foot, the young princes set out with Vishwamitra for the far distant ashram of the latter. En route, the royal sage put the princes through a course of practice with the bow and arrow. He further initiated them in two sacred mantrams, most potential in their counteracting effect on hunger, thirst, and fatigue of journey. 2 days and nights the trio passed in travel. On the third night, they encountered a Rakshasi named Talka, whom Ram forthwith slew at Vishwamitra's word of command, and finally they reached the ashram. Arrived at his cottage, Vishwamitra resumed his sacrifice, and soon the mischievous Rakshasas were on the scene. Two of them, Marich and Subahu, from up in the air emptied pots full of blood over the rising flames of sacrifice and on the head and face of the devout sage. Enraged at the sight of this daring sacrilege, Ram let fly his deadly darts, which precipitated the miscreant Rakshas to the earth. One was killed outright, the other Rama flung into the bottomless depths of the ocean beyond. And thus the royal sage was enabled to bring his sacrifice to a satisfactory termination. Vishwamitra now proposed to the young princes to proceed on a visit to Janak, king of Mithila, who at the time was engaged on a holy sacrifice, and accordingly they all set out for Mithila. Through labyrinths of dense forests, a long journey brought them to the borders of Ganges. The sight of its silvery waters, expanding far and wide in solemn silence, and meandering in many directions, struck the young princess with a profound sense of admiration, When Vishwamitra narrated to them how, in response to the prayer of Bhagirath, in connection with an Ashwamedha performed upon a time by King Sagar, the Lord Shiva let fall from his head this sacred river, which on reaching earth divided itself into 7 streams. They crossed its holy waters and proceeding further, sighted the ashram of Gautam, where they decided to step in for a while. They crossed its threshold when, lo, there rose to view from the under the ground a fair damsel, to the great astonishment of the princess. Soon the sage unfolded the mystery and set their excited minds at rest. The fair damsel, said he, was no other than Ahalya, the wife of Gautam, whom ages ago the curse of her husband transmogrified into stone. Because of her unchastity, and who, by the contact of Ram's sacred feet with the dust of that stone, was purged of her past iniquities and restored the life to life in fulfillment of a prophecy by Gautam. Arrived at Mithila, they found the king offering up his sacrifice, which over Vishwamitra presented the lads at the court of Janak, formally introducing them as the sons of King Dashrath and announcing at the same time their ardent desire to have a glimpse of the celebrated bow of Shiva, which lay in the archives of the Mithila palace, were treasured and preserved for the avowed purpose of testing the prowess of the royal personages. The king revealed to the sage a resolution of his to the effect that whosoever of royal descent proved himself capable of wielding this almighty bow would be rewarded with a prize no less than his handsome daughter Sita in marriage. So saying, he commanded the box containing the bow to be brought. 8 sturdy attendants of the king, with all their might and main, dragged the burdensome box of bow and arrows to the royal presence, where, besides the royal sage and princes, were gathered a vast assembly of palace officials, purohits, and retainers. At Vishwamitra's beck, Ram lifted the bow with perfect ease and alacrity and proceeded to bend and string it when behold. The mighty weapon, under the strain of Ram's inspired strength, broke asunder with a mighty crash as of a thunderbolt, to the utter bewilderment of all present. Janak was agreeably surprised and awestruck at this, and instantly set out not only to accomplish his promise with regard to Sita, but also to give his other daughter Urmila in marriage to Lakshman. Vishwamitra, being consulted with regard to the preliminaries, advised Janak to invite Dashrath and his 2 other sons at Ayodhya to the court of Mithila. They dutifully arrived at an auspicious hour of the day. All the 4 sons of Dashrath were united in matrimony in right royal fashion. Ram to Sita, Lakshman to Urmila, and Bharat and Shatrughan to Mandavi and Shruta Kirti, respectively, the nieces of Janak. The marriage celebrations over, Dashrath and his wedded sons, with their royal consorts, took their departure for Ayodhya. En route, they met Parshuram, whose jealousy was roused at the imposing spectacle of Ram escorting home the fair princess of Mithila. He forthwith defied Ram to wield all powerful bow of Vishnu. With extraordinary pluck and dash, the intrepid Ram seized the weapon and aimed, then demanded of Parshuram to say whither he shall let fly his arrow, for he could not brook the idea of his aim going unavailed. Discomfited over his bombastic challenge, Parshuram went his way sarcastically, telling Ram to aim at and destroy his divine power. Dashrath, Ram, and the rest, pursuing their homeward journey, reach Ayodhya in due course, where Ram and Sita lived many a long day together in the enjoyment of the highest connubial bliss. Ayodhya Kand. Bharat was absent on a visit to his maternal grandfather, accompanied by Shatrughan, when one day Dashrath, grey with years and careworn with the affairs of his kingdom, conceived the idea of placing Ram on the throne of Ayodhya. In solemn conclave, he consulted his ministers, courtiers, and subjects, who with one voice hailed the king's proposal with acclamation. The palace purohits were accordingly enjoined to have everything in readiness for Ram's coronation the following day. The news spread like wildfire over the city, which soon was gay and resplendent with decorations and illuminations in honor of the coming event, and as a necessary preliminary, the king elect and his fair spouse retired to the sanctum sanctorum of the palace temple in company with the chief purohit to spend the eve of coronation in silent supplication and fasting. Mischievous Mantra, a decrepit old maid servant of Kaikeyi, secretly set out to frustrate the king's intentions. Breathlessly, she hastened to Kaikeyi's apartments in the palace and broached to her royal mistress the news of the preparation that were proceeding space for Ram's coronation, which, said she, foreboded evil times for the queen, because with Ram's elevation to the throne, his mother Kaushalya would of course take precedence in the ranks of the royal household, and as a matter of consequence, the other queens would have to submit themselves to the humiliating position of the next in rank to Kaushalya. With unseeming concern, the queen listened to her old maid's premonitions, for thought she to herself, the remedy lay in her own hands. Did not Dashrath, during the war between the Rakshas and Devtas, solemnly promise to grant her at any time she liked any two boons of her own sweet choice? This then was the opportunity for her to demand the promised boons, and demand them she would in manner designed to defeat the king's calculations with regards to Ram and secure the crown for her son Bharat, thereby averting the evil forebodings of her maid Mantra. Thus resolved Kaikeyi cast aside the costly jewels which adorned her person, and effecting a sullen mood, retired into her private apartments. Rejoicing came Dashrath to relate to his fair spouse Kaikeyi the glad tidings of Ram's forthcoming coronation, when lo, the sullen queen, stepping gently forward, reminded the king his unfulfilled promise of old and demanded of him two boons. First, the banishment of Ram to forest, and second, the elevation of her son Bharat to the throne. For a moment, the king was dumbfounded. Then, prostrating himself before the fair queen, said he, "Anything save your present demands, which I scarce can yield as preparations for Ram's coronation, are far too advanced." But the queen was inexorable. With painful reluctance, Dashrath acquainted Ram of the preposterous demands of Kekai, but the dutiful son was not for contesting the matter. With true filial submission, he accepted a forest life for himself and cheerfully acquiesced in the accession of Bharat to the throne. Perfectly resigned to the situation, Ram gently broached the matter to his mother. It plunged Kaushalya in tears and sorrow at the sight of which Lakshman threatened the cruel monarch's life. But the wiser counsels of Ram prevailed. Kaushalya then resolved to cast in her lot with her ill fated son and insisted upon accompanying him to the forest. Ram, with paternal solicitude, counseled his disconsolate mother to remain behind and tend the age worn king, promising to return from the forest after 14 years. Next, Ram went into his own apartments in the palace and to his fair spouse, Sita, broached the appalling news of his banishment to the forest, admonishing her also to remain behind till his return after 14 years. But the faithful wife would brook no separation from her husband for all the world and firmly resolved to follow him to the forest. And needless to say, the ever inseparable brother Lakshman decided also to accompany him. Thus resolved, Ram, Sita, and Lakshman repaired to the palace and took leave of Dashrath. Sad was the parting as a king in tears, trickling down the wrinkles on his careworn countenance, bade farewell to his dutiful children. But alas, how sadder still, if but the king knew that this was his last farewell to them. In the royal chariot departed Ram, Sita, and Lakshman for the forest, and in its rear followed a surging crowd of loyal subjects weeping bitterly. The shades of night began to fall, and Ram betook himself to the foot of a forest tree to rest a while. His wailing subjects, weary with hunger and fatigue, fell soon in slumber deep. Unperceived by them, he resumed the journey, the chariot, moving ahead until the party reached Shringi Berapuram, where Guha, the chieftain of that place, received them with remarked hospitality, and Lakshman unfolded to the generous host the sad tale of Ram's banishment to the forest. Next morning, Guha placed a boat at the disposal of this distinguished guests, and in it Ram, Sita, and Lakshman, having said farewell to Sumantra, the Chakridir, crossed the waters of the Ganges. Their first night in the forest they spent under a banyan tree. Lakshman, by special direction of Ram, kept keeping a vigilant lookout for the safety and protection of Sita. Next day, the exiles reached the ashram of the sage Bhardwaj, with whose consent they pursued the weary travel to their final destination, the valley of Chitrakoot mountain, where perfectly resigned to the situation they entered upon their forest life. Meanwhile, Sumantra hastened back with his tale of sorrow to Ayodhya, hooted on every side by citizens as they gazed with disappointment upon the vacant chariot he contrived to reach the palace and, prostrating himself before his royal master, began to render a faithful account of the incidents of his journey with the princess and fair Sita up to the parting on the banks of Ganges. The whole night did it take him to narrate it all, and the whole night did the king patiently listen to it. It broke his heart. No longer could he endure the pang of separation from his exiled children, and as day dawned, the venerable monarch of Ayodhya passed away in peace, and Ram, Ram were the last words that fell from his dying lips. Bharat was recalled from his visit to the kingdom of Kaikais. He saw all Ayodhya wear an aspect of gloom and melancholy as he re entered the city. Arrived at the palace, he hastened to the apartment of his father, only to find him missing there, and then to his mother's apartments, where, prostrating himself before her, he made anxious inquiries about Dashrath, Ram, and others. Then was disclosed to him the painful intelligence of Ram's banishment and Dashrath's death. He was deeply moved and fell into a swoon. When consciousness returned to him, Bharat's rage knew no bounds. He cursed his mother and, seizing Mantra by her hair, would have taken away her life but for Kaikai intervening. Then, having performed the obsequies of his father, he called together his subjects and publicly rebuked the palace Purohit Vashisht for not counseling Dashrath against Ram's banishment, after which he decided to go in search of Ram, along with Shatrughan and the widowed queens, and accompanied by the army. They met Guha, the hunter chieftain, of whom they made inquiries and were shewn the spot where Ram passed that first night in the forest under a tree, where Bharat fainted away and the three widowed queens stood gazing in mute astonishment. Proceeding on, they met the sage Bhardwaj, who received them with marked hospitality, and having ascertained from him the exact spot where Ram was, they pursued the journey in direction of Chitrakoot mountain. In the far distant horizon, they saw rise on high a hut thatched with leaves and twining branches, and from a tree top beside that hut, Lakshman, spying from afar the multitude from Ayodhya approach, with Bharat in the forefront, informed Ram of it, saying he feared Bharat was bent on giving further trouble, besides taking the possession of the kingdom. But Ram allayed his anxieties, assuring him that Bharat's mission could scarcely be fraught with any ulterior designs. Soon the brothers Bharat and Shatrughan were at the cottage door, where, having prostrated themselves before Ram and Sita, Bharat prayed that Kaikai may be forgiven for the part that she played in bringing about the banishment of Ram. He then disclosed the sad news of Dashrath's death, whereat Ram was deeply affected and forthwith repaired to the waters of the Godavari, where he performed the obsequies of his father. Then, in the presence of the whole assemblage from Ayodhya, Bharat solemnly besought Ram to return and assume charge of his kingdom, but Ram would not be persuaded to do so. Bharat then prayed for the gift of Ram's sandals, which being granted, he returned to Ayodhya with the people in devout processional order, bearing the sandals on his head as a token of Ram's supremacy over the kingdom, and then moved on in the same order and with the sandals still on his head to Nandigram, where he solemnly enthroned them.